In a small town surrounded by endless fields and thick forests, there lived a farmer named Thomas. His life was simple, filled with the rhythm of nature and the hard work that came with it. Every morning, he woke up before the sun rose, pulling on his boots and stepping out into the cool air to check on his crops and animals. The farm had been in his family for generations, and though it wasn't large or fancy, it was his home. Each tree, each fence, and every patch of soil held memories of years gone by. Thomas loved his land deeply, and he took pride in keeping everything in order. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, Thomas decided to walk along the edge of his property. He often did this to make sure no deer or other animals had wandered too close to his crops. The air smelled fresh, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the silence. As he rounded a bend near the forest, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothing or maybe a scarecrow someone had left behind. But as he got closer, he realized it was a person. A young woman sat slumped on a fallen log, her head bowed and her shoulders shaking, slightly. She looked exhausted, her clothes torn and dirty and her face pale with fear. Thomas stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to startle her, so he stood quietly for a moment, observing. Then, clearing his throat, softly he called out, "You all right there?" The woman's head snapped up and her wide eyes met his. For a second she seemed confused, but then relief washed over her face. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. I think I'm lost." Her name was Emily, she explained, after catching her breath. She had come to the area for a solo hiking trip, thinking it would be a peaceful escape from the busyness of her city life. But things hadn't gone as planned. Somewhere along the trail, she had taken a wrong turn. Hours passed, and the path she thought she knew disappeared beneath the dense canopy of trees. Panic set in as the daylight faded, leaving her alone in the dark woods. She wandered aimlessly, her energy draining with every step, until finally, she stumbled upon Thomas's farm. By then, she was too tired to keep going. Thomas listened carefully, his heart softening at her story. He could see the fear still lingering in her eyes, even though she tried to stay calm. Without hesitation, he reached out a hand. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you back to the house. You can rest there and we'll figure out how to get you home." Emily hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Her grip was weak, but she managed a small smile of gratitude. Together they began walking across the fields, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them. As they moved, Emily told him more about herself. She worked as a graphic designer in the city, a job that kept her glued to her computer screen for most of the day. Hiking was her way of reconnecting with nature and finding peace, but this time it had turned into a nightmare. She admitted she hadn't prepared well enough. No map, no compass, just a vague idea of where she was going. "I guess I underestimated how tricky these trails could be," she said with a nervous laugh. Thomas nodded but didn't say much. He understood how easy it was to lose your way in the wilderness. Over the years, he'd seen many hikers pass through, some better prepared than others. When they reached the farmhouse, Thomas ushered Emily inside. The interior was cozy, with wooden beams overhead and a fireplace that added warmth to the room. He handed her a thick woolen blanket and told her to sit by the fire while he made coffee. The smell of freshly brewed coffee soon filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the countryside. Emily wrapped the blanket tightly around herself, feeling some of the tension ease from her body. For the first time in hours, she felt safe. While the coffee brewed, Thomas picked up the phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. He explained the situation briefly, giving them Emily's description and location. They promised to send someone right away. As they waited, Emily thanked Thomas again and again, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. Thomas simply smiled and waved off her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied, though deep down he knew not everyone would. The arrival of the sheriff's deputy brought a sense of closure to the ordeal. Emily was checked over by paramedics, who assured everyone she was fine, just dehydrated and shaken. But what happened next shocked both Thomas and Emily. Moments after the deputy left, 2 police cars pulled into the driveway, their lights flashing brightly against the morning sky. Behind them came several unmarked vehicles carrying men in suits who stepped out with serious expressions. It turned out Emily wasn't just any hiker. She was the daughter of a wealthy businessman whose disappearance had caused a frenzy in nearby cities. News of her rescue spread quickly, drawing reporters and lawyers to Thomas's doorstep almost instantly. Reporters crowded around the farm, shouting questions and snapping photos. Lawyers began asking probing questions about Emily's time on the property, hinting at possible legal issues involving trespassing or negligence. Thomas stood amidst the chaos, bewildered but composed. He repeated over and over that he had simply done what anyone would do. He helped someone in need. Despite the noise and confusion, he remained steadfast, refusing to let the sudden attention change who he was. And though he couldn't have known it then, this unexpected event would leave a lasting mark on his quiet life, opening doors to new experiences and connections he never imagined. As the chaos unfolded outside his farmhouse, Thomas stood by the window watching the scene with a mix of disbelief and resignation. Reporters shouted questions at him from the yard, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Lawyers scribbled notes on notepads, exchanging serious looks as they whispered among themselves. The quiet life he had always known seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a whirlwind of attention he never asked for. Yet, despite the noise and commotion, Thomas remained calm. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, and he certainly didn't crave drama. All he wanted was to return to his simple routine, tending to his crops, feeding his animals, and enjoying the peace of the countryside. Emily, still wrapped in the woolen blanket, sat quietly at the kitchen table. She watched the scene unfold. Through the window, her expression a mixture of guilt and gratitude. "This is all because of me," she murmured, more to herself than to Thomas. Her voice was soft, but it carried enough weight to make Thomas turn and look at her. He shook his head gently, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. "Don't think like that," he said firmly but kindly. "You didn't ask for any of this. None of us did." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "But it's my fault you're dealing with all this," she insisted. "If I hadn't gotten lost, none of this would have happened." Thomas leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. He thought for a moment before speaking. "Life has a way of throwing surprises at us," he said slowly. "Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but what matters is how we handle them. You needed help and I gave it, that's all there is to it." His words were simple, yet they carried a wisdom that came from years of living close to the land. Emily nodded, though. She still looked troubled. She knew he was right, but it didn't ease the weight she felt pressing down on her chest. Outside, the reporters grew louder, their voices overlapping as they tried to get Thomas's attention. One particularly persistent journalist managed to step closer to the house, holding a microphone toward the window. "Mr. Thomas," he called out, "did you expect any reward for saving Emily? What do you plan to do now?" Thomas sighed deeply and stood up. Without saying a word, he walked to the door and opened it just wide enough to address the crowd. "I don't want anything," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "I helped someone in need. That's all there is to it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." With that, he closed the door and turned back to Emily, who was watching him with admiration. The lawyers, however, weren't so easily dismissed. They lingered near the driveway, huddled together as they discussed the situation. Some of them approached the house, knocking politely on the door. When Thomas answered, they introduced themselves as representatives of Emily's family. They explained that her father, a wealthy businessman named Richard Grayson, was immensely grateful for what Thomas had done. In fact, Mr. Grayson wanted to express his thanks personally and ensure that Thomas was properly compensated for his role in rescuing Emily. Thomas listened patiently, his face unreadable. When they finished speaking, he simply shook his head. "I don't need compensation," he said. "I'm just glad she's safe." The lawyers exchanged glances, clearly unaccustomed to such a response. One of them pressed further, suggesting that even if Thomas didn't want money, there might be other ways to show appreciation, perhaps a formal recognition or a donation to a cause he cared about. Thomas considered this for a moment but ultimately declined. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I prefer to keep things simple. This farm, my life, it's all I need." The lawyers nodded reluctantly, jotting down notes before stepping away. Though they respected his decision, it was clear they found it unusual. In their world, actions often came with strings attached, whether financial or legal. But Thomas lived by a different set of rules. As the day wore on, the crowd began to thin. Reporters packed up their equipment, sensing they wouldn't get much more from Thomas. Lawyers climbed into their cars, heading back to the city to report on the peculiar farmer who refused both fame and fortune. By late afternoon, only a few stragglers remained lingering near the edge of the property. The farm, which had been alive with activity just hours earlier, returned to its usual quiet state. Thomas stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air, and letting the calmness settle over him. For a brief moment, it felt like everything might go back to normal. But deep down, Thomas knew that wasn't entirely true. The events of the day had left an imprint on his life, one that couldn't be erased no matter how much he wished for simplicity. Neighbors would talk, strangers would visit, and memories of the media frenzy would linger for weeks, maybe months. Still, he chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he focused on the present, the sun setting behind the hills, the sound of crickets chirping in the distance, and the comforting familiarity of his surroundings. Life, he reminded himself, was unpredictable. Sometimes it threw challenges your way. Other times it brought unexpected blessings, and sometimes it did both at once. Inside the house, Emily watched Thomas move about the farm through the window. She admired his strength and humility, qualities that seemed rare in the fast-paced world she came from. As she sipped the last of her coffee, she realized she didn't want to leave just yet. There was something about this place, and about Thomas, that made her feel grounded in a way she hadn't felt in years. Before she could change her mind, she stood up and walked to the door, stepping outside to join him. The evening air was cool, and the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. "Thank you again," she said softly, standing beside him. "For everything." Thomas glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're welcome," he replied. "But remember, kindness doesn't ask for anything in return. It just asks to be passed along." Emily nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She didn't fully understand what the future held, but for now, she was content to stand there, watching the sunset with a man who had taught her more in one day than she had learned in years. The next morning, the farm was quiet again, but the effects of the previous day lingered like the faint scent of rain after a storm. Thomas woke up early, as he always did, and went about his usual routine. He fed the chickens, checked on the cows, and inspected the crops for any signs of damage from the recent weather. The rhythm of the work helped him push aside the chaos that had invaded his life. Yet, every now and then, his thoughts drifted back to Emily and the whirlwind of attention she had brought with her. He couldn't deny that the experience had shaken him, even if only a little. For someone who valued peace and simplicity, the sudden intrusion felt like a storm hitting land, unavoidable and overwhelming. As he worked, Thomas noticed a car pulling into the driveway. At first, he thought it might be another curious visitor or reporter hoping to get a story. But when he saw Emily step out of the vehicle, relief washed over him. She looked different this time, not as tired or frightened as she had been the day before. Instead, she carried herself with a sense of purpose, her hiking gear replaced by casual clothes. She waved at him, a hesitant smile on her face, and walked toward him. "I wasn't sure if I should come back," she admitted as she approached. "But I wanted to see how you were doing." Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth and smiled warmly. "You're always welcome here," he said simply. "How's your family? Did they take care of you?" Emily nodded, her expression softening. They were so worried. "My dad especially, he hasn't stopped apologizing for not coming himself. He's tied up with meetings, but he sent me here to thank you properly." She paused, glancing around at the fields and the farmhouse. This place feels peaceful. I needed that after everything. Thomas chuckled softly. Peace is what we do best around here, he said. No cameras, no lawyers, just the land and the sky. Emily laughed, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. It must be nice to live like this, she murmured, away from all the noise. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He knew that while his life might seem idyllic to someone like Emily, it came with its own challenges, long hours, unpredictable weather, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. Still, he wouldn't trade it for anything. It has its ups and downs, he finally said. But I've never wanted anything else. Emily nodded thoughtfully, then reached into her bag. She pulled out an envelope and held it out to him. This is from my dad, she explained. He insisted I give it to you. It's a way of saying thank you. Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the envelope but not taking it. Emily, he began, his tone gentle but firm, you don't owe me anything. I helped because it was the right thing to do. Emily bit her lip, clearly torn between respecting his wishes and fulfilling her father's request. I know, she said eventually. But please just take it. If not for you, then for him. He needs to feel like he's done something. After a long pause, Thomas accepted the envelope, though reluctantly. He set it aside without opening it, making it clear that whatever was inside wouldn't change how he felt about what had happened. Emily seemed to understand, nodding in silent agreement. Can I help you with anything? She asked, changing the subject. I'd like to do something useful while I'm here. Thomas raised an eyebrow, amused by the idea of a city girl helping out on a farm. But he didn't dismiss her offer. Well, he said, gesturing toward the barn, there's always work to be done. You can start by feeding the chickens if you want. For the rest of the morning, Emily followed Thomas around the farm, learning the basics of his daily tasks. At first she struggled, dropping feed, tripping over uneven ground, and accidentally startling the animals. But she soon found her rhythm. There was something therapeutic about the work, she realized. Each task required focus and care, leaving little room for worry or stress. By the time they took a break for lunch, Emily was covered in dirt and sweat, but she wore a wide grin. This is harder than it looks, she admitted as they sat down at the kitchen table. Thomas laughed, handing her a glass of cold water. Most things are, he replied. But you did good. Over lunch, Emily opened up about her life in the city. She talked about her job, her friends, and the pressures of living in a fast-paced environment. Thomas listened intently, asking questions when appropriate but mostly letting her speak. He could see how much she valued the escape the farm provided, even if it was temporary. When she finished talking, she turned the conversation back to him. What made you decide to stay here? She asked. Did you ever think about leaving? Thomas leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before answering. I did once, he admitted. When I was younger, I thought about moving to the city, trying something new, but the farther I got from this place, the more I realized it's where I belong. This land, it's part of me, just like I'm part of it. Emily nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She couldn't imagine staying in one place for so long, yet she envied the deep connection he had with his surroundings. As the afternoon passed, the two continued working together, sharing stories and laughter. For a brief moment, it felt like the events of the previous day had never happened. The farm was peaceful again, and Thomas found himself enjoying Emily's company more than he expected. She was curious, kind, and eager to learn, qualities he admired in anyone. Still, he knew she wouldn't stay forever. Her world was miles away from his, both literally and figuratively, and while he appreciated her gratitude, he also understood that their lives would eventually diverge once more. By evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Emily stood outside, gazing at the view as Thomas joined her. I should probably head back soon, she said quietly. My dad will be wondering where I am. Thomas nodded, though he felt a pang of regret at the thought of her leaving. "You're welcome to come back anytime," he said sincerely. "This place will always be here if you need it." Emily smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As she drove away, Thomas watched until her car disappeared down the road. He stood there for a moment longer, the cool breeze brushing against his face. Life had thrown him an unexpected curveball, but he had handled it with grace and humility. The experience had reminded him of something important, that even in a world full of chaos, kindness could still shine through. And sometimes that was enough to make all the difference. The days that followed Emily's visit were quieter, but the memory of her time on the farm stayed with Thomas like a soft echo. He went about his routine as usual, feeding the animals, tending to the crops, and fixing the old fence posts that had seen better days. Yet there was a subtle shift in the air, something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the lingering traces of chaos from the media frenzy, or the occasional stranger who still showed up at his doorstep, asking questions or seeking directions. It was more personal than that. Helping Emily had reminded him of the simple power of kindness, and it left him feeling both grounded and reflective. One afternoon, as Thomas worked in the fields, he noticed a car slowing down on the dirt road leading to his farm. At first he thought it might be another curious passerby or perhaps even Emily returning for another visit. But when the car stopped and a man stepped out, Thomas realized this was someone different. The man wore a suit, his polished shoes contrasting sharply with the muddy ground. He introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, Emily's father, and explained that he had come personally to thank Thomas. "I owe you more than words can say," Mr. Grayson said, his voice filled with emotion. "You brought my daughter back to me." Thomas shook the man's hand firmly, though he felt slightly uncomfortable with the formal gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied simply. "She needed help and I gave it." Mr. Grayson nodded, but his expression made it clear he didn't entirely agree. To him, what Thomas had done was extraordinary, a rare act of selflessness, in a world often driven by selfishness. "Still," Mr. Grayson continued, "I wanted to meet you in person, and—" He hesitated, glancing around at the modest farmhouse and the sprawling fields. "I wanted to see the place where she found safety." The two men spent the next hour walking around the farm, with Thomas explaining the ins and outs of his daily life. Mr. Grayson listened intently, clearly fascinated by the simplicity and hard work that defined Thomas's existence. For a man who spent most of his time in boardrooms and luxury cars, the farm was a stark contrast to everything he knew. Yet, there was a charm to it, a sense of purpose and connection to the land that he couldn't help but admire. "It's beautiful here," Mr. Grayson said at one point, looking out over the golden fields bathed in late afternoon sunlight. "Peaceful. I can see why Emily felt so safe." As they stood side by side watching the horizon, Mr. Grayson brought up the envelope Emily had delivered earlier. "Did you open it?" he asked gently. Thomas shook his head. "No, and I don't plan to," he admitted. "I didn't help your daughter for money or recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Mr. Grayson sighed, though not in frustration, in understanding. "I respect that," he said. "But please let me do something, a donation maybe, or improvements to the farm. You deserve it." Thomas thought for a moment before responding. "If you really want to do something," he said slowly, "why not support the community instead? There are families around here who could use the help. Schools, too. They're always short on resources." Mr. Grayson smiled, nodding enthusiastically. "That's a wonderful idea," he said. "Consider it done." The two men shook hands again, this time with a mutual understanding. Though their lives were vastly different, they shared a common goal, to make the world a little better, each in their own way. After Mr. Grayson left, Thomas returned to his work, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter had reminded him of how interconnected people were, even when they seemed worlds apart. His small act of kindness had rippled outward, touching not only Emily and her family but also the wider community. It was a humbling realization, one that reinforced his belief in the importance of doing good without expecting anything in return. Few days later, Thomas received a letter in the mail. It was from Emily, written in her neat handwriting. She thanked him once again for his kindness and shared how much her time on the farm had meant to her. "Being there reminded me of what truly matters," she wrote. "People, connection, and the beauty of simplicity. I'll never forget it." Enclosed with the letter was a photograph of the two of them standing together near the barn, taken during her visit. Thomas smiled as he looked at it, tucking it safely into a drawer for safekeeping. Life on the farm gradually returned to normal, though subtle changes began to appear. Neighbors started stopping by more often, sharing stories and offering help with repairs. Some mentioned hearing about Thomas's generosity and wanted to express their admiration. Others simply enjoyed the camaraderie, grateful for the reminder of what it meant to look out for one another. Even the local school benefited from Mr. Grayson's promise, receiving new books and supplies that brightened the students' days. Through it all, Thomas remained humble, never seeking credit for what he had done. He knew that life was unpredictable, full of twists and turns that no one could foresee. But he also knew that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to create ripples that reached far beyond what anyone could imagine. As he watched the sun set over his fields one evening, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The farm was still his home, the land still his companion, and though the world outside might change, some things would always remain the same. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas noticed how the small changes in his life began to settle into a new rhythm. The attention from reporters and strangers had faded almost completely, leaving behind only faint traces of the whirlwind that had once swept through his farm. Neighbors still talked about it occasionally, but their focus had shifted back to their own lives, harvests, weather patterns, and the upcoming holidays. For Thomas, this return to normalcy was comforting. Yet, he couldn't deny that something inside him had shifted too. Helping Emily and meeting her father had reminded him of the invisible threads that connected people, even across great distances and differences. It made him more aware of the world beyond his fields, without making him feel like he needed to be part of it. One crisp morning, as frost clung to the grass and the air carried a sharp chill, Thomas received another unexpected visitor. This time it was a young man named Jake, who introduced himself as a journalist working for a small-town newspaper. Unlike the aggressive reporters from before, Jake seemed different, calmer, more respectful. He explained that he wasn't there to pry or sensationalize, but to write a story about kindness in everyday life. "People hear so much bad news," Jake said earnestly. "I wanted to highlight something good. Your story stood out to me." Thomas hesitated at first. He didn't seek recognition, and the idea of being featured in a newspaper made him uneasy. But Jake's sincerity won him over. "All right," Thomas agreed finally, "but don't make me sound like some kind of hero. I just did what anyone would do." Jake smiled and promised to keep the tone humble and honest. Over the next hour, they sat on the porch sipping coffee as Thomas shared bits and pieces of his life, how he grew up on the farm, his love for the land, and the simple joys of hard work. When Jake asked about Emily, Thomas spoke briefly, emphasizing that helping her had been an ordinary act, nothing extraordinary. The article appeared in the local paper a few days later, accompanied by a photograph of Thomas standing near his barn. True to his word, Jake wrote about Thomas with warmth and respect, focusing not on drama but on the quiet strength of character that defined him. The piece resonated with readers, sparking conversations in nearby towns and even inspiring a few donations to community projects. Thomas chuckled when neighbors mentioned the article, brushing off their praise with a modest smile. "It's just my life," he'd say. "Nothing special." Meanwhile, Emily kept her promise to visit again. She arrived one Saturday afternoon, bringing with her a basket of homemade cookies and a fresh energy that brightened the farmhouse. She told Thomas she had taken a short break from work to spend time reconnecting with nature and reflecting on the lessons she had learned during her misadventure. This place feels like a second home now, she confessed as they walked through the fields together. Every time I come here, I feel lighter. Thomas appreciated her honesty and enjoyed her company. They spent the day catching up, sharing stories, and working side by side on small tasks around the farm. Emily had improved since her last visit, moving with greater confidence and skill as she helped feed the animals and gather eggs. By evening, they sat on the porch watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "You've changed," Thomas remarked thoughtfully. "In a good way." Emily laughed softly. "Maybe I have. Being here reminds me of what really matters. Back in the city, it's easy to get caught up in things that don't matter at all." Their conversation drifted to other topics: books they had read, places they hoped to visit, and dreams they still held close. Thomas found himself opening up more than usual, sharing memories of his late wife and the years they had spent building a life together on the farm. Emily listened, intently, her presence creating a safe space for him to reflect on both happy and bittersweet moments. By the end of the evening, they felt like old friends, bound by shared experiences and mutual respect. Before leaving, Emily handed Thomas a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," she said shyly, "but I wanted you to have it." Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting to be filled. "I thought maybe you could use it to jot down thoughts or ideas," she explained. "Or sketches of the farm. Whatever you want." Thomas ran his fingers over the smooth cover, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "This means a lot." After Emily left, Thomas spent some time flipping through the journal, imagining the possibilities it held. Though he wasn't much of a writer, the idea of capturing snippets of his life appealed to him. That night, sitting by the fire, he picked up a pen and began writing. A few sentences about the day, a memory of his wife, and a note about Emily's latest visit. It felt strange at first, putting words to paper, but also strangely satisfying. Perhaps, he thought, this was another way to leave a mark, however small, on the world. As autumn deepened into winter, the farm settled into its usual quiet routine. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling sound and transforming the landscape into a serene white canvas. Thomas continued his work, undeterred by the cold, finding peace in the solitude and beauty of the season. Occasionally, he thought about Emily and Mr. Grayson, wondering how they were doing in their busy lives. He hoped they were well, just as he hoped the community projects supported by Mr. Grayson's generosity were thriving. Through it all, Thomas remained steadfast in his belief that kindness mattered, not because it brought rewards or recognition, but because it created connections that lasted long after the moment had passed. His actions may have seemed small to others, but to him, they were proof that even in a complicated world, simplicity and compassion could shine brightly. And as he looked out over his snow-covered fields, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for his life, his land, and the unexpected ways it had touched others. Spring arrived slowly, melting away the snow and bringing new life to Thomas's farm. The fields turned green again, and the air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers. It was a time of renewal, not just for the land, but also for Thomas himself. Over the winter, he had grown accustomed to writing in the journal Emily had given him. At first, it had been sporadic, just a few lines here and there about the weather or his thoughts on the day. But as the weeks passed, he found himself reaching for the journal more often, filling its pages with memories, reflections, and even sketches of the farm. Writing became a way for him to process his experiences and appreciate the simple joys of his life. One sunny morning, as Thomas tended to his crops, he noticed a familiar car pulling into the driveway. His heart warmed when he saw Emily step out, her smile as bright as the spring sunshine. She looked different this time, more relaxed, more confident. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced," she said as she approached. Thomas shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You're always welcome," he replied. "What brings you here this time?" Emily held up a backpack. "I brought some supplies for the school donation drive your neighbor told me about, and I wanted to see how you were doing. Thomas nodded approvingly. He had heard about the ongoing efforts to support local schools, thanks in part to Mr. Grayson's initial contribution. The community had rallied around the cause, organizing fundraisers and collecting supplies to ensure every child had what they needed. That's kind of you, he said. The kids will love it. Together they unloaded the backpack, sorting through notebooks, pencils, and art supplies. As they worked, Emily shared updates about her life. She had started volunteering at a community garden in the city, inspired by her time on the farm. It's not quite the same, she admitted with a laugh, but it feels good to give back. Afterward, they sat on the porch enjoying the warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze that rustled the leaves. Emily glanced at the journal lying on the table beside Thomas. Have you been using it? She asked curiously. Thomas picked it up, flipping through the pages. More than I expected, he admitted. It's nice to write things down, to remember them. Emily beamed with pride. I'm glad you like it, she said. Maybe someday you'll let me read it. Thomas chuckled. We'll see, he teased. It's mostly just ramblings about the farm and the weather. Their conversation eventually turned to the impact of that fateful autumn day when Emily had stumbled onto the farm. She confessed that the experience had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Before I thought success meant climbing the corporate ladder or buying fancy things, she said. But now I realize it's about connections, with people, with nature, with yourself. You taught me that. Thomas listened quietly, touched by her words. I didn't teach you anything, he said humbly. You figured it out on your own. As the afternoon wore on, Emily helped Thomas plant seeds in the vegetable garden, laughing as dirt smeared across her hands. This is harder than it looks, she joked. Thomas smiled, watching her enthusiasm. Despite her city upbringing, she had a natural curiosity and willingness to learn that reminded him of simpler times. By the time they finished, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. I should probably head back soon, Emily said reluctantly, but I'll come again, I promise. When she left, Thomas stood by the gate waving until her car disappeared down the road. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Emily's friendship, but for the ripple effect of kindness that had touched so many lives. From the school donations to the renewed sense of community spirit, the events of the past year had shown him how interconnected everything truly was. Even the smallest act of compassion could create waves that reached far beyond what anyone could predict. Later that evening, Thomas sat by the fire, opening his journal to a fresh page. He wrote about Emily's visit, the progress in the fields, and the quiet beauty of spring. As he closed the journal, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that autumn morning. The chaos and attention had faded, leaving behind something far more valuable, a deeper appreciation for the world around him and the people in it. He realized that while he couldn't control what life threw his way, he could choose how to respond. And choosing kindness, he decided, was always worth it. The seasons would continue to change, bringing new challenges and opportunities. But Thomas knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened, he would face it with the same steadfastness and humility that had guided him all along. Life on the farm wasn't perfect, it never had been, but it was enough. It was home. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, the sound of crickets chirping outside, he felt a profound sense of peace. In a world full of noise and uncertainty, he had found his place, and he was content.